The following presentation was recorded live at the 2015 National Bioneers Conference. To learn more about Bioneers programs and media products, visit www.bioneers.org.
Thank you so much for coming to this afternoon session, Why the Wild Wilderness in the Anthropocene, which is just one of several different pronunciations of that neologism you're going to hear this afternoon, and we'll explain what it is. My name's Jason Mark. One thing by way of disclosing my conflict of interest, since this panel was organized, I'm no longer with Earth Island Journal. I'm now editor of Sierra Magazine. So Sierra Club has got a couple folks here on this panel. We didn't mean to outnumber everybody else. That it was an organic happening. I wrote a book, came out a couple weeks ago. You can get it at the bookstore, called Satellites in the High Country, Searching for the Wild in the Age of Man, which explores whether, in fact, there's anything that's still really, truly wild in what some are calling the human age, again, the Anthropocene, and if so, how can we hold on to wildness as a touchstone? And I was invited by the Bioneers folks to organize this panel with some folks who've got a lot of ideas on this subject. And so I'm really happy that they're all here this afternoon to share their thoughts with you. First off, here is Mapp. She's the founder of Outdoor Afro, which is dedicated to using digital media to boost the numbers of African Americans participating in organized outdoor recreation activities. She's an entrepreneur. She's the creator of Oakland's game hobby startup It's Your Move, which is in my neighborhood. It's really fantastic. And she was invited to the White House to participate in both America's Great Outdoors Conference and the First Lady's Let's Move initiative. Last year, Rue and I had the really fun pleasure of rafting to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one of the iconic American wilderness areas, and became good friends there. To her left is Richard White. He's a distinguished historian at Stanford University who teaches environmental history. He's the past president of the Organization of American Historians and is the author of a number of important and influential books on the American West, Native American history, railroads, environmental history. He's won a number of prestigious Guggenheim and MacArthur fellowships, and twice he's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Among his books is The Organic Machine. And then to his left is Bruce Hamilton. He's the current deputy executive director of the Sierra Club, but he's been there for 38 years and is really, in many ways, the heart and soul of the contemporary Sierra Club. He started as a regional organizer, then he was the national field director, and later he was the national conservation director. He's also served on many national and international advisory boards, including currently on the World Commission on Protected Areas. Before joining the Sierra Club, he was the field editor of that wonderful, fantastic Western magazine, High Country News. So if you don't know High Country News, check it out. It's really a wonderful publication. So the first question, we're going to keep this more casual. We're not going to have set presentations from folks. Keep it more like a little bit of like a dining room, dinner time conversation that we'll all have, and you guys will get to listen in on for, let's say, maybe 45, 60 minutes, and then we'll open it up so we can all have a conversation together. The first question I want to ask everybody is that, is there a place for wilderness in the 21st century? Again, kind of taking in the fact that there's 7 billion people on the planet. We're continuing to use up more and more of the planet's ice-free surface, and at the same time are causing, global planetary disruption or changes to the chemistry of the atmosphere, also the chemistry of the oceans, making the oceans more acidic. Our immense telecommunication technologies are kind of putting the human presence into more and more places. Given all these facts, is there a place for wilderness in the 21st century, and kind of what does that look like?
I'll jump right in. Is that loud enough back there? Good. Okay. Well, in my 40 years with the Sierra Club, I've worked on campaigns that have saved about 200 million acres of wilderness. If you're talking about strict wilderness, there's about another 100 million acres of U.S. territory that is suitable that we, the next generation, need to work in order to protect. So there's still a lot to do. But let me just talk about it in broader terms, too. Is there a place for wilderness? There's got to be a place for wilderness. Wilderness is where we came from. Wilderness is what we learned from. And wilderness is the future that I want for my kids and my grandkids. and beyond there. So I think it's absolutely vital that we have it. If you look at the Wild Foundation, it's a group that works on wilderness internationally. You know, they have a campaign that talks about keeping half of the land mass wild. We don't have that opportunity in the lower 48 in the United States, but nevertheless, a lot needs to happen as far as restoration too. We shouldn't just look at this and say, where are the pure spots that have never been touched and that's all that's left, and then we'll go draw a circle around those. I think we need to be far more expansive and look at restoration. If you look at the wilderness areas in the eastern United States, all of those at one time were clear-cut in its second growth. But people love that, cherish it, and now it provides many of the same resources that people value with areas out here that were never clear-cut that are wilderness. So I just think there's lots of ways that we need to proceed to bring back the wild and do rewilding, because we have gone too far in the wrong direction, and we need to now restore the balance, even if in the Anthropocene we're stuck in a situation where we've done major climatic and global interference.
Yeah, I think we need it now more than ever, but my take on it is probably a little different than many people in the room, is that essentially I think many of the places we call wilderness that were originally preserved were never anything but a cultural wilderness. They were something we defined as wild. And that what we call wild lands are a matter of definition, they're a matter of management. And I think, in fact, the good side of that is you can lose wilderness, but you can also gain it. There are places, you know, as you just said, that were not wild, which can be made wild. Point Reyes, which is right over the coast, is a place which was developed in dairy ranches and cattle ranches. It's now become wilderness. Once we begin to think of wilderness as, in fact, a kind of place that we create that meets certain criteria, we can make more of it. And I certainly think we need to make more of it, because as the planet grows bigger, as we have a larger population, as our impact increases, that's all the more reason that we try to have places where our touch is never going to vanish, but where we minimize it, where they say there's certain things we simply are not going to do. It's a matter of our restraint.
So Jason, you and I have talked about people in nature. And for me, and for those of you who just came into the room, my name is Mapp, and I am the founder and CEO of Outdoor Afro, where Black people in nature meet. And for real. And we talked about earlier using that digital conversation, and that's how Outdoor Afro began, as a blog about my sharing of who I was and what I loved about the outdoors. And the story that I shared began to resonate with more people who thought, like I did, that I was the only one, especially as I got away from cities and I was in more wilderness areas, more isolated places. And there's a tension that I've become more and more aware of between specifically African Americans and the wild. You know, we are living with some generational memory of trauma in the wild. We can remember Billie Holiday's song, Strange Fruit, that was about the bodies of men hanging from trees. And so we have people who have some trauma that they need to overcome. And so Outdoor Afro has really been thinking a lot about the wilderness as a platform for healing. A platform where we can not only protect and heal these precious spaces, but also to heal ourselves. And really, again, thinking about, for instance, in this last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of both the Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights Act. And I did a little bit of research to figure out if there were, conversations in 1964 America happening that could have bridged the two together, if they had shared a similar caucus. And I don't see any evidence that that really happened. And talking to many people who were around at that time, it didn't happen. But we have this opportunity today to tell a new narrative, to tell a new story about the wild and who's involved with it and how we can create new pathways and opportunities to engage with nature. And I'm finding that with Outdoor Afro, people are getting out by the thousands, and they're doing it with one another and discovering that wild close to home and far away. And I think that we have to build these relationships, repair these relationships to the wild before we can think about how we can expect people to invest in its preservation.
So thank you guys all for that. We're going to come back to a lot of the things that Rue was just talking about. I want to ask you a question, Richard, that might stir some more conversation among the whole panel here. In a paper you wrote recently, and I understood that you delivered at UCLA earlier this year, you wrote, Muir's idea, and again, John Muir, the famous conservationist, he's on our state quarter here, and of course, famously the founder of the Sierra Club. You wrote that John Muir's idea of wilderness is increasingly untenable. So what is that? What do you mean by that, and why is it untenable?
Well, what I meant is that what Muir did 100 and 150 years ago was divide California, because essentially he based the idea here. He divided California into three parts. One was going to be the Sierras, which were supposedly untouched. It was where it's nature's workshop. Down below that was going to be the Central Valley, which was, he hated to see the grasslands go. He hated to see that land change, but he said it's inevitable. It's going to become agricultural. And the third part, he said, is going to be pretty much the coast, San Francisco, Los Angeles, the cities, where there's no nature at all. I think all of those ideas are untenable in the early 21st century because, first of all, we've now touched everything. And even when Muir wrote about it, to make the high Sierras wild in his sense, you had to kick Indian peoples out. And if you go through the mountains of California, you can read vicious things he says about Indian people, that they have no place that they belong there. To create a place empty of humans, you had to empty it of humans. The second place is down below. That clearly, the Central Valley today is not what Muir ever imagined it would be. This is not a pastoral landscape as he imagined it. And the third part is, if we're going to live on the planet, I think that nature cannot be consigned simply to one area, a wilderness. Nature is everywhere. I mean, nature is in cities. Nature has to be sustained wherever we find it. And that's what I meant. It's not that I'm opposed to the wild, but I think Muir had a 19th century conception of how this works, which simply doesn't fit on a 21st century landscape.
I'm wondering, Bruce, if you've got any response to that, and I guess also the question is, you know, how do you take the passions and the sort of spiritual part of Muir's love for the wild, but then update it into 21st century science and reality, and how do you kind of keep the best relevant while recognizing that some things maybe just don't make sense 125 years later?
Yeah, well, first, we all need to acknowledge that appalling things were done to the Native Americans when they were driven out. They weren't driven out by John Muir. They were gone by the time he arrived in California, but nevertheless, you know, he then sought to protect the landscape after the Native Americans were driven out by the military and the settlers and the gold miners. You know, that aside, looking forward and what we have today and what we have to do in the future needs to incorporate indigenous people. You know, if you look at the way that we try to accommodate indigenous people and at the same time protect a living landscape and a working landscape, whether it's in the Amazon or in the Arctic or wherever it is, you know, there are opportunities to get it right. We got it wrong in the Sierra Nevada. We never should have expelled the indigenous people. And so, you know, they're now looking at different ways to sort of make restitution and figure out how to accommodate Native people. So the Yurok in Redwood National Park, and how can they live in harmony with the park there? Jason, in his book, writes about the Sioux, Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation in the Black Hills and the prairies there, and the wilderness in Badlands National Park. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act clearly tried to identify how to keep natives on the land and have them managing their own lands and, you know, protecting the wilderness in the process. And if the International Union of Conservation of Nature looks at it, there's a whole different variety of wild areas, including ones that are occupied by indigenous people. So, you know, I think we need to learn from the mistakes and, you know, frankly, undo many of the mistakes and try to bring restitution to those people that were thrown off the land. But I don't think that wilderness and, you know, accommodating indigenous people that have lived on the land for centuries are incompatible.
Which I guess brings me to another question. I'd love to hear your take on it, Rue, and then from all of you, which is sort of like, how do we fit people within our idea of wildness? Because, yeah, it's kind of, I think we all agree, you know, the sort of 19th century view of wilderness, which bled into the part of the 20th century conservation movement, was like, there's no people in the picture, right? There's no people in the frame of the photograph. And so my question first for you and then for both Bruce and Richard is, where do people fit in the picture of wildness and wilderness? Like, where do you kind of, where's the little person in the frame? If at all, there's no people in the frame, I don't know. But if there are to be people in the picture, where are they?
I think I'd like to reframe that a little differently because, in my work, I'm constantly helping to remind us that we are nature. This separation of people and nature is problematic. I mean, just the way that our bodies are composed, and we are affected by the moon and the cycles of the tides. I mean, these are all things that are a part of who we are. And I think that we can imagine that nature is a place to really help us discover that piece of who we are that we often forget in these busy, overscheduled, and technologically filled lives. And specifically, though, on the piece of representation, I do have some slides, and I think, if it's appropriate, I can share them. But a big piece of the work that I'm doing is also about helping to shift the visual representation of who we imagine.
Well, you want to show some of your slides in terms of the people in the picture?
I can, yeah. So when we do see that picture, that picture is often of someone who doesn't look like me. And it's one person standing over a sweeping vista. And the way that Outdoor Afro has come to express itself is very much in the community experience. And it's not just about that individual person, but it's about how they're connected to something larger. Oh, there you go. Okay. So this is my Outdoor Afro leadership team. These are people from around the country. This is the garbage man, the attorney, the accountant, people who are not the traditional backpack oriented people, but who have a fire in their belly for nature. And of course, this all began with my own family and experiences backpacking. This is me and our party last year in the Arctic, our visitor in the Arctic. But of course, I think a lot about how does that Arctic experience play out in places like East Oakland, where I live, where this is the kind of nature that's available for folks. And again, remembering that there's an asset-based conversation that we're often not thinking about, and that is, people having a history of connecting to nature. But let me just scroll ahead to just a few things, a few opportunities that we take around the country that really try to bring harmony into these urban spaces. This is Chicago, kayaks in the front and skyscrapers in the back. Taking time to really learn about our ecology and a people's history. Taking risks together because you feel more courageous when you're with your friends and your family. Remembering those traditions that maybe you did as a child and re-sparking those interests as an adult. And these are all people, I like to point out this picture because these are all people who didn't even know each other before summiting Mount Diablo in the East Bay, but there's something about being in nature and connecting with one another that builds community. And we really try and play that up. And remembering, of course, wonder. This man's probably 35 years old, but with that banana slug in his hand, he's 4 years old again. And this is a little girl and her mom visiting the snow for the first time. And then this conservation ethic we introduce after people have built a solid relationship with a place. We're careful not to ask them to work before play. And then just remembering that it's not always about, this is right here in Golden Gate National Recreation Area, human beings doing what humans have done through time eternal, and that's to sit around a fire and tell their stories. So those are the types of experiences that we're trying to create and also recreate so that we have a new narrative in nature that's not, just one that is about the antiquities and this otherness and the untrammeled land, but thinking about our connectedness, our being of nature, and building community within that.
I'm sorry you guys don't have any slides as well, but again, the question is sort of where do people fit in the picture, or kind of what's a virtuous engagement?
I'm not sure if I can say what a virtuous engagement is, but there's going to be an engagement. And I think, as I said at the beginning, the critical thing is going to be restraints. I couldn't agree more that we're embodied creatures. We're as much animals as any other animal on the planet. And every time we see something like Ebola, every time we worry about diseases, we realize, in fact, that we are not separate from nature. That nature is very much a part of it, and nature, in fact, can prey on us. That kind of line cannot simply be drawn. The critical thing is, what do we do in a wilderness area that's different outside of a wilderness area? And I think what we have to do is have an agreement there's certain things that we won't do. And that's the hard part. That's the set of rules. That's the set of rules which establishes what a wilderness is. You go into this area, and as you go into it, you haven't changed, though I agree with Rue, it can change you once you're there. But in fact, there's ways you're going to have to behave differently. And there are ways we have to agree to behave differently. But those become a public question. Those become the kind of things that if you ever look at the Forest Service or anything else, there's a giant volume which says what you can and can't do in a wilderness area. That's what defines what these places are. And that's why wilderness is always going to be about politics. And it's going to be about politics, which is going to be hard because ideally in this country, the rules should apply to everybody. But since we've talked about Indian peoples, there are certain rights that might be grandfathered in for some groups that, in fact, that other people cannot do. That's just simply the way it's going to be. But I think that's the critical thing. What we have to do is have the restraint that when we move into these areas, we are not going to do certain things. What's harder now is we used to believe if we let them alone, everything will be in balance. We know that's not true. We also know that if we want certain things to exist there, we're going to have certain kinds of interventions. That if you want biodiversity to continue there, you might have to intervene to see that some species can maintain themselves. We've created an incredibly complicated world, and there's no easy way out of it.
Totally agree. I would just say, we need to break down this idea that there's the human environment and then there's nature as if it's something apart. I mean, I feel most human when I'm out in a wilderness area. But it's a different kind of humanness than if you're sitting in front of a computer screen in a busy city. But I think the danger that I see in this is when people start saying, oh, well, man is a part of nature, so therefore man is an integral part of wilderness, and wilderness never really exists, that it's then an excuse to turn around and say, so there's no sense bothering to save it, and as a result, let's stop pretending that this wilderness fiction is something that's worth saving, and instead we can just go run over the planet because we're part of nature. And I think that's where you can head down a totally wrong direction. We've gone too far in that direction ever since the start of the industrial age, and we actually need to reverse that trend and recognize our place in nature, which is as another creature on this planet and not the dominant species that has a geologic epoch named after it called the Anthropocene. I mean, that is the most bit of hubris I can think of, the idea that we would turn around and decide that, we have created a geologic era because we're the most important force. I mean, it is true. We are acting right now like we are the asteroid or the volcano that brings on the sixth extinction. But we also have the ability to act in restraint and not let that happen, and to be more humble, and that's what we need to do.
So on this question, because it's really interesting, and again, it's not an academic question, it's really, I don't know if there's any land managers or people from the field of conservation biology in the room, but there's a real tension, and you were kind of bringing it up, Richard, it's in your article, between when do we decide to be hands-off and when do we decide to intervene, right? Because increasingly we're not just conserving landscapes, we curate them, right? We decide which species we like. We go and shoot and kill barred owls to protect the smaller endangered spotted owl. Or we shoot and kill sea lions at the mouth of the Columbia River to protect endangered steelhead and salmon runs. So, and these are Sophie's choices, right? These are tough choices. And so I guess the question is, at what time and what places do we decide, okay, we are going to make an intervention here because we've got other goals like biodiversity, and at what times do we say we're just going to kind of go hands off and act? I think your word, Richard, was restraint, and sort of the value of restraint.
I served on a committee at Stanford, which seemed like a very simple problem at the time. It's to take down, or what to do about a 100-year-old dam which is silted up and which blocks the steelhead run. It was not a simple question. Because what happens is once you've intervened and you've created something, behind that you created habitat. You created some of the best bird habitat and some of the best wetland habitat on the peninsula. If you take down the dam, you're destroying that habitat for a steelhead run that was probably always small and which may not survive global warming. And besides that, when they built the dam, there was nobody living downstream, and now there's hundreds of thousands of people living downstream. And so it seemed to be a fairly simple question, was actually a series of trade-offs. Which species are going to be privileged over other species? Which kinds of rights of some human beings are going to be privileged over other human beings? And it turned out to be something that was very, very difficult. But the way that we decided, which this is a sort of a cop-out, I'll be dead before it ever happens, is that in fact we would take a series of steps and see what happened next. That in fact what we would do is we would try to forsake this kind of hubris that we can plan out what's going to happen over the next 30 or 40 years. We're going to try this is what we're going to think is going to happen. If that happens, then we'll do this. If it doesn't happen, then we'll do this. That's the best we could do. I don't think there's any way you can get a flat yes or no answer. I mean, this is going to be something which once you've begun to engage in it, there is no backing away. There is no way now that I think at some point nature will just take care of it unless it really takes care of it. And in that case, we have nothing to worry about.
What dam are you talking about?
Searsville Dam. It's a dam unless you live in the peninsula you probably know nothing about.
All right. It's an interesting book that Professor Anthony Bernowski from Cal wrote called Heat Stroke. And in it, he struggles with this issue. And he basically suggests that there's certain places where we should let natural forces take hold, that it should be self-willed, which is what wildness is. But outside the wilderness area is where there can be more gardening and more assisted migration and more interventionist attempts at management. I think that's generally a good rule, but of course it depends on the exact situation. I mean, if there is a species about to go extinct and it is in and only in a wilderness area, I would be an advocate for intervening in there in order to protect that species because I don't want to see it go extinct if in fact we're the cause of it. And so I think it varies depending upon the situation and how dire it is. People turn around and, talk about how Joshua trees will go extinct in Joshua Tree National Park. Well, if you look back at the geologic record, you see that in other times of climate change, the Joshua trees were able to migrate and avoid extinction because they co-evolved with giant ground sloths. They don't exist anymore. They used to eat the fruit and poop it out and walk great distances. But they're actually Joshua trees, not just in Joshua Tree National Park. They also exist throughout the Mojave, way up in the high desert. And it may well be that a good strategy, rather than irrigating the Joshua trees to try to retain them in Joshua Tree National Park, is to create a new Joshua Tree National Park North. And maybe they die out in the south naturally, but we still have Joshua trees. Now, if it was the only place they lived was in Joshua Tree National Park, I'd get more enthusiastic about some gardening there.
Rue, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just had this moment where I was like looking at the room and looking at our panel, and we got to get more people involved in this conversation. We've got to get more people of different ages, of different backgrounds, of different ethnicities and classes to be, because we all are in this together. When I think about the people who are affected by climate change, we don't have to go any further than our own, borders, Katrina, to see that the effects of climate change disproportionately affect low-income and stressed communities. I just feel, that this is the urgency of the work that I'm doing, that we've got to cultivate folks to be able to have these types of conversations, to make these kinds of very complex and important decisions. And I'm hoping that one piece of the work that I'm doing, linking arms with, others represented in this room and on this panel, that we can do that. Our planet depends on this movement, this conversation about the wild, who writes about the wild, to look different.
Which is a perfect segue. Thank you, Rue, into another question. So I think, Richard, you said it's all about politics. And it's true. It's like I have a very hard time thinking of any, and Bruce, maybe you can think of a couple, but almost every big preservation or conservation movement is contested by someone. There's always contested ground, and there's going to be some sort of political battle between interests and communities. So given that, and given that the stakes in some ways are higher than ever because of these massive planetary scale changes, So that's the question. How to engage more people in this conversation and or just in the embodied, visceral experience of being out in wild areas, not necessarily designated wilderness, but again, maybe the nearby nature of the Point Reyes National Seashore or of the, Berryessa Snow Mountain, well, that's maybe remote, but of the, pinnacles. You can get there driving off 101 and you take a left and you're there. So how do we get people into some of those places or the San Gabriels, how to get more people engaged in these conversations and in this sort of, this political effort?
I think what it's going to be is the way that I have no idea how most people in this room first got interested in wild areas or natural areas. But usually, at least for me and most people I know, it did not begin with suddenly going up to the Sierras, or suddenly going to a wilderness area. It began in places like ravines in Los Angeles, which you could wander down as a kid, abandoned orchards, a local landscape that suddenly became deeply interesting. I think one of the things you have to do is engage people at that level, and particularly in a state, because I realize this is a state where there is no longer a majority racial or ethnic group. This is a state that is made up of a very diverse population, which in fact, I agree perfectly. Unless a politics combines all the people in the state, it is going to become a series of turf wars, and that's exactly what we cannot afford. So I think what you have to do is you have to start. That's why it's so important to me to recognize that wild areas are important, and I'm all for them. But so too are the kinds of ways in which wild things that exist in cities and suburbs and the countryside are the way that most human beings get in touch with them. I mean, one of the things that we have here, which is a sort of scandal, you have the bay, and the bay is the most neglected natural feature in this whole landscape. Virtually nobody except poor people go to the bay, which is good, but for most of the places, the bay is walled off from human beings. Opening up areas where, in fact, people can get to natural features will lead them to others, and that, I think, is the beginning of this kind of politics. If you don't do that, then it's going to be a pretty tough haul.
Well, with the People's Climate March in New York, it said to change everything, you need everyone. That it wasn't going to just be white environmentalists that were going to solve the climate problem if we didn't have people of all ethnicities, people of all walks of life, businessmen, labor, you name it. It wasn't going to work. And the same thing's too about protecting wildlands. I mean, one of the beauties, he talks about the San Gabriel National Monument that President Obama just designated. The way that this was established was breaking the mold for protecting wildlands. Used to be the Sierra Club would sit in its little Lafitte white community and they would pull out a map and they would draw their little circle around what they wanted to do, and they would organize their members and they would go lobby their friends in Congress and they would get it. And it didn't really involve the community, and there was no dialogue at the beginning. And what we did with the San Gabriels was just the opposite. We sat down with the local communities. We sat down with all the constituents. It turns out that this is right in the backyard of the Hispanic community there, and that's the main place they go to recreate. So we wanted to find out, what do they want? What's their future? How do they use this land? How would they like to use this land? What kind of services would they like? And similarly, we went to the Asian community, and we went to the hunters and anglers in the area and tried to build this big, broad coalition. And in fact, we were successful in doing it. And one of the reasons that President Obama found it so easy to designate this area is because all but a few hardcore off-road vehicle types that wanted to rip up the land and felt that, preservation wasn't a good idea were behind it. All the local chambers of commerce were backing it. All the government agencies around there, City of Los Angeles, City of Riverside, City of San Bernardino, they all said, yeah, we want this monument. And that's the new model, but you have to bring people in at the beginning. You have to, if it is an area up in Alaska, talk to the native communities there and find out from them. Right now, we're working on a Greater Grand Canyon watershed national monument. And our primary allies are 22 Indian tribes around there. What do the Havasupai want? What do the Wallapai want? What do the Navajo want? What do the Hopi want? And they're the ones that are leading this effort, and then we're trying to provide the backup troops in order to make this whole thing happen. So it's a very different way of going about it, and it's far more inclusive, and it'll ultimately be far more successful. And I think the product at the end of the day, it may not be pure wilderness. You know, in the case of the San Gabriels, you know, the Latino community there said, you know, we want bilingual signage, we want more restrooms, we want more picnic tables. You know, that's the way that they use that land. So they may not get into the backcountry, but if you don't accommodate the uses for the area that they recognize and value and feel are important, then you aren't going to succeed.
Ru?
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head, Bruce. And for me, it's all about relevancy. And you can be successful or you can fail by design. Not having the right people, asking people what they want, just starting there and being willing to respond based on what people's values are is very important. For some people, it's like, for instance, the national parks heard from the African American community that the grills were not big enough for ribs, okay? Now, I mean, you may think that that's not a big deal, right? But, you know, in order for people to choose to go to that particular place, it has to accommodate with multi-generational family experiences. You need a bigger picnic area. But again, it's about asking and responding and lifting up those resources and opportunities. And I also just have to shout out the Sierra Club because I really love the network weaving that's happening now, where I had the chance, as you know, to go to the Arctic. And going to the Arctic as an African-American woman and coming back and telling that story of the Arctic, of this vulnerable place, really left a different kind of impression than if I looked different than the community. So I think we have to also not only be relevant, but we have to find the right community amplifiers to tell our story. And that person may be the pastor at a local church. It may be a trusted youth development professional. But it's not necessary always that we're in the middle of the solution and visible in the solution, but really lifting up what's already successful and culturally and relevantly aligned with the populations that we want to lift up in this conversation.
And I would just, one thing I think I would share on this tip, you gave a shout out to the Sierra Club. I also give a shout out to the National Park Service, which I think is doing a really good job and is playing catch up in some ways, but the National Park Service is really committed to making sure that the people who enjoy the parks reflect the diversity of this country. And in my experience, at least increasing in front country experiences, it's actually quite diverse, maybe not exactly looking like the whole country, but I think it's getting better, and I think the Park Service is really being conscientious about, you've got Dorothy Firecloud at Montezuma's Castle, you had Reed Robinson, who's Lakota Sioux at Devil's Tower, Bears Lodge, and you're seeing more and more people of color superintendents running the parks. So lightning round. What makes you, when you think about these big questions about, how to hold on to the conservation ethic in the 21st century, especially where it seems to me that the effort for the environmental movement's effort, climate change is obviously sucking a lot of the air out of the room because it's such a huge threat. So, let's do this question, then we'll do lightning round. So kind of how to hold on to the conservation ethic, these kind of ideas of restraint. You were talking about when it becomes more important than ever to garden, when so much of the energy, I think a lot of the movement we see around food justice movements and food resiliency and food shed resiliency, all that's coming back to this desire of, we're going to have to build the life raft. So how do we once build the life raft and hold on to these ideas of just some places, again, we're going to treat differently? Oh, that's a stumper. Yes.
I'm never at a loss for words.
Bruce, he can't stump Bruce. That's true.
I would say the big issue as far as the future of wildlands protection is just getting more people engaged, particularly young people in the next generation. And so, too many are losing touch with nature. There's this nature deficit disorder that Richard Louv talks about. And the more that we can get the next generation, as well as diverse audiences, out in nature to experience it, whether it's a neighborhood park or it's the backcountry, it doesn't really matter. It's just having nature in your life so that's something you want to value, that's something you want to defend, that's something you want to go work for. So I just think that's the biggest challenge for us that I see moving forward. And if we don't have that and the constituency for wildland protection shrinks and dies off with my generation, then I worry about the future of the Earth.
What I mean by this restraint is you can go back 100 years ago. Sometimes it's a good thing to do, and see what, in fact, land managers and wilderness advocates advocated for the United States. And what you realize, with all the good intentions in the world, it was a mess. We didn't do very well. This is not the planet anybody ever planned to turn out. What we do next, we have to remember all of that. We have to think what we're going to do is we have to act. We have no choice, but I think we have to act without hubris. We have to act with some modesty. We have to be willing to admit we were wrong. I mean, the part that scares me the most about a certain section of the environmental movement now is the big picture, everybody to the cities and the coast, opening up the whole land. It's going to become all wilderness, this idea that we're going to remodel, regain the whole planet. It's not going to work. We're not smart enough to do that. So what we have to do is think about these things with modesty, incrementally. We have to think about them democratically. And that, this is, back to my own youth, this is a good time not to follow leaders and watch the parking meters. Think this thing through before we go all the way to having big plans that are going to solve everything, whether they're technocratic fixes or any other kind of fix.
For me, it's about relationships, always at the core. It's about the relationships that we're able to cultivate with the new generation. And some of the folks, who are of our generation, who, are having awakenings in nature themselves all the time. And really rethinking this idea of leave no trace. There's something about getting your hands in the dirt. There is something about, our wild not being treated like a museum, but a place that we have a real, visceral, connected relationship with, and calling that out in our experiences. So I really feel that unless we really cultivate relationships with these places, starting from when we were young all the way through adulthood, we will not be able to spark conservation effort and ethic because the relationship's not there. How can you take care of something you don't care about?
So, Bruce, you said, sometimes you've got those moments when you worry about the fate of the Earth or worry about the future of the Earth. I think we all do. You wouldn't be here in this room. You wouldn't have made your way to the Bioneers conference if you didn't have an inkling that we are not on the smartest trajectory. So what is, on the other side of the coin, what's something that leaves you optimistic, that keeps you hopeful when you think about the challenge of keeping some parts of wildness alive in the 21st century?
Well, it's just like when you look at civil rights and you talk about, the arc of justice, that we are at the same time doing and continuing to do some stupid things. We're also doing some pretty smart things, and we're learning from them. That if you look at the way we used to treat our national forests, as far as just clear cutting them, handing them over to all the timber industry, moving on, and so there weren't any old growth areas left in the entire eastern United States, and you look at where we are today on how we manage our national forests, we have a long way to go, but we have moved in the right direction. We've adopted the Endangered Species Act and said, these species have a right to exist on the planet, and we're going to restrain our activity and not go forward with them. I mean, one of the most hopeful things I just had 3 weeks ago, I was up in Olympic National Park, and there we've taken out 2 dams and restored 6 species of salmon going up the Elwha River. And I saw those salmon coming back up, and I saw the sediment coming down from those old dam sites and restoring the river mouth. And it was just a beautiful thing. I mean, it still, looks ugly in a moonscape because there's a lot more restoration that needs to take place. But a society that can turn around and decide we're going to undo the damage and bring back the salmon for those local Native Americans that have lost that species that was central to their culture for the last 100 years, and undo that mistake, that's what really gives me hope. And I really think that there's a lot that can be done. David Brower used to talk about What we need now is not just a matter of preservation. Let's go lock up the last of the wilderness, and then that's all we'll have. But he talked about global CPR, conservation, preservation, restoration. And the restoration was the big piece of it. And if you think about climate change and the fact that we're already over 350 parts per million, and we have to get back below that, the way you get back below it is by basically having the land sequestering carbon, treating the land differently. So the way we are grazing the land, the way we're logging the forests, the way we're doing agriculture, whether it's going to be sustainable, organic, low-till, no-till, or whether it's going to be industrial agriculture with a lot of ammonium phosphate fertilizer. Those kind of practices, if they get reversed, can actually bring us back down below 350. And we're starting to see that transition take place, but it's going to take a lot of organizing and a lot of education and a lot of politics to make it happen.
Richard, well, but what if anything? Maybe there's none, but what if anything keeps you optimistic?
I've been working with Indian tribes for about 40 years, and 40 years ago we could not have sat on the panel together because a Sierra Club member would never say anything like I just heard. That was about Indian fishing rights on the Nisqually. The major opponents of Indian fishing rights was the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club has turned around a great deal since then, and I think one of the things that it's turned around is not only its attention to native rights, but also this idea that, in fact, you are not going to solve environmental problems without also solving social problems. That might seem obvious to us now. It was not so obvious 40 years ago. They were seen as utterly discrete kinds of things, and one came at the expense of another. So if there's one thing that actually encourages me, is that is now a common part of the conversation, and that actually very few people talk in any other way. So that's something that's deeply encouraging to me, and part of the sign is, 40 years ago, this panel would not have been constituted this way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel a lot of hope. This work is so much about love versus the fight, and the thing that also gives me hope is I have a lot of colleagues. There's a new field that has emerged around diverse engagement with the outdoors. There's a wonderful group called Latino Outdoors, for instance, who I link arms with. So I think that, to echo what we've already heard, that people are really seeing nature and the wild as really the true open source platform that it actually is. That it's the place where we can go to, find what we need as individuals, as communities, but also, with an eye toward taking care of it. And I'm really especially excited about really thinking about the ways that we can not separate out people and place, but that, we have this opportunity now to not only create this new narrative, but a narrative that is about protecting vulnerable places and vulnerable people.
Yeah, I'm really glad you used the word, the four-letter word, love, because I do think a lot of this work comes back to a righteous love of place. It doesn't, again, matter where that place is, but I think, always the efforts to sustain, preserve, conserve, restore wild nature comes back to people's, intimate, personal, visceral feeling of love for some place. And I would agree with you, Richard, when you sort of hear often sort of the technocratic discourse that comes out of some parts of the broader environmental movement, and it's all about ecosystem services and this, and all that stuff is fine and good, but if we don't bring it back to love, it's love that's going to get 400,000 people out in the streets of New York City marching for a world worth saving. But what gives me hope is all of these bright and shiny faces in this room. And so with that, I want to make sure we've got a conversation. There is a mic up here. Really going to encourage you guys to do one-part question. Not a three-part statement, as best as you can. So I don't, you're going to sort of Donahue the room there?
Donahue.
Yeah, remember that?
That
guy.
That's
Yeah, that is throwback. Yeah. Yes, please.
So my question is specifically about the wilderness ethic of leaving things untouched, specifically around the narrative of a pristine pre-Columbian America that the native people all over have done a lot of stewardship of the land. For example, right here at China Camp State Park, there are no longer cattails in the marsh because they require a lot of cultivation, and since the native people have been pushed out here, there are no longer cattails that were a keystone species. And so I'm wondering if specifically, Bruce, if you could speak a little bit more to that and the importance of stewardship, that there really is no baseline state where we let nature take its own course, that there's always been human involvement for thousands of years in our land here.
Well, you are correct. Humans have had a major impact, and there is probably no place that, is totally untouched that way. The question is, do you need to necessarily try to restore things to the state that was there when the Native Americans were prescribed burning? I don't know. In my mind, it sort of depends on what is the nature of the land and how are you trying to manage it. If cattails don't exist in China Camp, even though they were there at the time of the Native Americans, that's not necessarily something bad. If it's been replaced by, some terrible invasive species, that's another matter.
It has its pampas grass.
Yeah, okay, well, not such a great thing. China Camp also isn't a wilderness. It's got lots of different invasive species and a lot of European grasses and everything else. So I don't really know the answer. All I can say is I think we need to be a little less absolute about the whole thing and just try to look at a landscape and without being total gardeners and deciding exactly how we want it, try to look at the trade-offs and figure out what's important to bring back. And, from my standpoint up in the Olympics, bringing back the salmon was really important. That's part of the culture, and it really just made good sense. But as far as trying to sort of bring back every pre-Columbian species, I'm not there. I'm trying to, I think the mountain goats, which aren't native to Olympic National Park and are actually causing a great deal of damage, I'm in favor of the Park Service actually getting rid of those and letting the native elk and the native mule deer be the primary ungulates that are there. But I think it varies landscape by landscape.
And I'm really glad you asked that question. I think it's impossible to talk about wilderness, especially in North America, but really anywhere, without including the stories of the people who lived here right before Columbus stumbled on the place. So it's clearly a huge part of the conversation. I think it's important to keep in mind that Native societies, for the most part, were involved in a stewardship of nature or in a relationship with nature that still retained the recurrence of natural systems, and that our industrial or post-industrial society, when we start to manage things, often interrupts the recurrence of natural systems. And so it gets tricky, right? Because I think all of us in this room, we want to have a view of wild areas that includes human history and doesn't remove, again, people from the picture, and that history is part of the story of place. It's what takes something from being mere scenery, right, to being a real place, when you return human history and human stories to the landscape. But it can also, and we should all be aware of this, the new knowledge we have now from archaeology, from paleobiology, of pre-Columbian landscape management is often used by forces on the political right to then excuse interventions that would probably, among the indigenous folks who are here, or all of us in the room, would boggle the mind. So you can have, last year, in fact, the conservative commentator Jonah Goldberg writing a nationally syndicated column saying there should be no reason why we should not dump iron filings into the oceans to counteract global warming because native communities were burning the continent 10,000 years ago. So it's like a really tricky both and to hold, I think, us, people, progressives, environmentalists, or however you want to identify. It's a tricky thing to hold in your mind at once, that knowledge of indigenous landscape management, and yet not allow that knowledge to be rhetorical cover for forces on the right who would say, well, it's never been a wilderness, so just screw it. Which again, Jonah Goldberg's column appeared in newspapers across this country. That was 13 months ago he wrote this. This is part of the discourse that's out there now. So it's tricky, and to have that historical awareness. Should we queue up? Was that more fair, or do you want to wander around the room? Okay, you're going to wander around the room. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Luna. I wanted to kind of ask a question to go deeper in the way of like, how do we engage people in this? Because while I love the idea of urban permaculture and getting people just to like visit places and engage in small ways, the idea of REI being always an available resource to like get your backpack and your tools to go out into the wilderness might not always be an available option. And so like, how do we integrate into education, like ways to be in the wild, like how to use the resources that are in the wild and be with them rather than take? And how can we do that from like a young age? Like, what are your positions on how we can rewild through education? And like a lot of after-school programs in areas are having like primitive skills and ancestral arts kind of after-school programs, and that's really far-fetched for a lot of places. So,
Rue, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can't say enough that we have to work from a point of relevancy and asking communities what they want, and that answer is going to vary. It's going to vary depending on where they are, what their values and needs are. I find that for busy working families and stressed communities, connecting to nature is very low on the list of priorities. And this transactionality that we've got to take the kids someplace and they can have this evangelistic moment in nature so that they can have some like specific outcome toward conservation is one we have to disrupt, because people are just, there's a lot of pressing concerns about public safety, for instance. There are people who look like me who don't feel comfortable being out in public, in pristine areas or in areas where they don't see a lot of people who look like them. So we have a lot of repair to do with some communities, and finding those pathways where people feel safe and welcomed in the outdoors is incredibly important. There's a family, I don't know if you all follow the news, about a month and a half ago that went camping. It's a family that goes camping every year. And some of the folks in the neighboring campground started hurling racial epithets and chasing them with shovels. This is the kind of stuff that's happening out there where people are not necessarily feeling welcome. And that has a reverberating effect where if someone hears that story in a community or a family, they're going to say no to the possibility of perhaps their child going out, especially their child going out with someone from outside the community. So we've got to cultivate, I think, as well as heal, cultivation of leadership that looks like the community, and really paying attention to what people's values are within that community as a way to inform how to do that.
There are lots of people who don't know how to make a fire. And so when there's a hurricane in a place and it's cold and there's just basic survival skills that city or even suburban areas just have no even concept of like, oh, I could make a fire to keep warm and keep myself alive. That isn't even something that they feel confident in their ability to do.
Yeah, and I'm just saying that before that people can get to that point, their survival skills are much more immediate. Like, how do I walk home safely with my Skittles and my Snapple? So those are the kind of survival skills that are more pressing for some people before we can get to the point of whether or not they know how to camp.
Richard, or let's just see if Richard or Bruce have got a response to that question.
The only thing I'd add to it is when you do set up programs like this, like Stanford set up one to bring students to Jasper Ridge, it's where the social justice questions come in. In fact, the students who can afford to have a bus and have insurance and have teachers to take them to Jasper Ridge are students who probably don't need the Jasper Ridge experience. They get out anyways. For the poor school districts, they can't afford to do it. They don't have the insurance to do it. And so, in fact, as immediately you set up these programs, they segregate themselves out in terms of costs, poor school districts, rich school districts. You have to solve both together.
I would just add that having more nearby nature available so that it's not just a remote experience that requires a bus and 4 days, but instead people have it right in their backyard. So if you can restore the Los Angeles River or some shoreline that right now might be contaminated, anything like that, is good introductory path.
Let's do, You, ma'am, and then the guy right behind her. Yeah.
I want to thank you for the panel. I could identify with so much of what each one of you said, and I grew up being able to do what you said. In Maryland, stepping out my backyard and the woods, and then crossing a road, and there's a whole old estate, and so I've brought that with me to, to backpacking in the past and working locally. But so what you said about love, there's so much, and the effect of stepping in, management. These things all tie together with an issue that, for me, in the East Bay Hills, the issue of the intervention to, you all probably know about being part of the Sierra Club, but to advocate to cut down thousands and thousands of trees that are, quote, non-native. And there's a fire issue, but I won't talk too long on it. But some people that have studied this, that are fire managers, say it's a land transformation plan, not a fire prevention plan. So I'm just saying that sitting down and talking with what the community really wants is something, to me, really important. But it does get complicated when there's a FEMA program, and then there's different lawsuits. But I would just love to see people being able to sit down and create something new, preserve a little area for the whip snakes and do this and that, but not cut down these beautiful trees that hold the land connected to the earth, the forest, the fog drip that comes in, and the moisture, and to have the kind of terrain where the fires are going right now. Anyway, I've said probably enough, but I guess I'm just saying that can't we all sit down together and, like the Native Americans managed it with fire, but it's a different kind of grass now, I think, that would come. So there's a lot of complicated issues in this, and a lot of people don't even know this is happening. There's a woman, I sat down at a table, a Sierra Club member, she didn't know there was a plan like this, but how do we allow people in the Yodeler to make comments and not have them cut out, not because they are not the same as the Yodeler's comments. So how do we open this discussion up is my question.
I guess the question is, how do you open the discussion up, and/or any response about plans for some tree cutting and thinning in the East Bay Regional Park districts and other places? Is that the question?
I don't know. I mean, it is so complicated, and I'm not sure everybody here wants to hear about it. I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards. So it's something where there are ways you can have a dialogue and come to some conclusion. We aren't advocating clear-cutting all the East Bay Hills and taking out all the eucalyptus, but we do want to see some restoration and some thinning, and we'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hey there. Do you see any areas in California where you can reintroduce predators and keystone species like beavers to kind of jumpstart restoration? Rewild, basically.
Predators are reintroducing themselves right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what happens. If predators start coming back, then you're probably going to have to manage predators. I mean, the wolves come back in, then you're going to have to do something about wolves. But in fact, that becomes a management problem. Grizzlies would be something very different, because I think those probably are going to have to be reintroduced if they come back in, and that would be a firestorm. So a lot of this seems to me that you pick your battles, that you decide which are the most important battles, which are going to make the biggest difference, and you go to that, rather than, in fact, turning the whole thing into the kind of iconic battles where we should tear down the Hetch Hetchy Dam, or we should reintroduce grizzlies. In theory, those are both fine, but those battles we really want to fight right now, are those the most pressing kinds of problems? So that would be my answer.
Can I just tackle that? Because I'm writing an article right now about reintroducing the grizzly to California. I mean, first of all, you're right, Richard. The predators are coming back on their own. So this time, for the first time since 1924, there was a mountain lion spotting in San Francisco, which I think probably came up from the peninsula and then headed back down. I think folks know that wolves have now reestablished themselves up in the northeastern corner of the state, having come it's amazing, right? Some wolf had to swim the Snake River at some point to get in from Idaho to Washington, Oregon, and then has now moved from Washington, Oregon down into California. It's an incredible story of rewilding. On the grizzly bears thing, I would just say I'd recommend the work of Richard's colleague, Martin Lewis, who's a geographer at Stanford. I think if you Google him, you can probably find his slides, but he's got a pretty convincing, I don't know if you've seen it, Richard, he's got a pretty convincing slideshow of how you could do grizzly reintroduction, not just in the Sierras, but in fact some parts of the coastal range, including the new Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, because of course the California grizzly, a lot of it was in the coastal savanna, not just in the high country of the mountains. So yes, it would kick up a firestorm, but perhaps it would be worth it as a mind bomb, just to kind of shake people out of themselves. I think who's next?
Is that okay?
I think folks, sorry, on this side of the room, I think there's a queue developing, so I think if you're really eager to ask a question, maybe come around over here, and that's probably the most democratic and fair way of doing it.
Thanks, guys. In the context of hospitality in the wilderness and providing roots in, what sort of challenges have you guys been facing, or do you know if people have been facing as far as providing infrastructure for hospitality, picnic benches, signage, making people feel safe within the last few years of the defunding of the Forest Service and other things like that? And then what strategies have you used to work with that?
There is designated wilderness on national forests where you wouldn't have a lot of facilities, except if it's necessary to protect the resource. So on occasion, there may be a solar toilet that's put in there, or they have some distribution place where you can actually carry your poop out of, Mount Shasta or Mount Whitney when, the human impact becomes so great. But, you don't turn around and for convenience decide you're going to put picnic tables in a wilderness area. On the other hand, there's lots of backcountry or front country where, those kind of things, can be accommodated. It's true, Forest Service doesn't have the resources to do much of anything, even pick up the trash, let alone, right now the Forest Service has become the fire service. Over 50% of their budget is just putting out fires. And so, the amount of time that they can spend on any kind of recreation, wilderness enhancement, the kind of things you're talking about just keeps getting narrower and narrower, and then there's a stranglehold with the budgeteers in the Republican Congress. So I just don't see a lot of prospects for investment. If you look at the maintenance backlog in the national parks, it's just mind-boggling and disheartening. I was just in the Grand Canyon a week ago, and, the water system there is falling apart to the point where, they aren't going to be able to provide adequate water for the visitors on the South Rim. And yet the amount of money it would take to restore the 100-year-old water system is something that the Congress won't give them the money for it. So I'm not very hopeful there until we have a change in politics.
Just really quickly, I think that hospitality just starts with all of us in this room. It is not the responsibility only of the land management agencies, but it's about how we're inviting our neighbors, the people in our sphere of influence, how we treat people who, may look different than us in those wild places, so that, we're not treating them like a rare species, but as a neighbor, as a friend. So I find that, even though we've got all these really great intentions at the agency level, there's still a need to trickle down those values among park users. So I would encourage us all to be ambassadors to nature in your own community.
Thank you, guys.
I just want to say I think this is the most quintessentially Bioneers panel I've ever been to, and really well moderated too. So thank you. My head's swimming with a lot of questions. I and my company graze cattle on a research preserve about an hour north of here. So this intersection of human use and nature and wilderness and conservation biology is my bread and butter every day when I'm with the herd or out with the ecologists in the field, when we're like, what do we do about this thistle? Or, this is a non-native perennial bunch grass, but it is a perennial bunch grass. So things get really fuzzy, and I think that's a really cool place to be in. My question is primarily for Rue, but obviously open to anyone, and it's from more of a vocational perspective. I grew up in a really rural area back in the Southeast, and I didn't really know what it meant to go on a camping trip. I've been farming since I was 16, and it wasn't until I was hanging out with my hipster graphic designer friends at college that I was like, oh, nature is a thing you go to with your new Patagonia backpack and whatever. So my exposure to nature has always been vocationally through my job. So I've always, on the one hand, been paid to be there, but on the other hand, it's where I chose to be. But I recognize that this is kind of a difficult issue for a lot of people of color, right? Because the notion of laboring in nature obviously has a pretty tenuous history. And yet I see that we need a lot more boots on the ground from a regenerative perspective, whether that's in pure conservation or agriculture or whatever. So is there a way, and what is that way, to bring more people of more backgrounds and more colors, so to speak, into vocational trades in nature that are equitable at the same time?
That's a great question. I love that. I love the last piece about equity. So it's not just about the labor, but actually being in the C-suite too, right? My background is pretty similar to yours. My parents are from the South. They're first-generation Californians, and they brought with them their connection to land. And we had a ranch up in Lake County, and I grew up on the ranch with cows and pigs and a very vocational relationship with nature. And I, too, had my hipster San Francisco roommates who introduced me.
Now they're all farmers, I'm sure.
Yeah, right. Right, it's a whole other conversation. And so what I really appreciate about that experience is it was a long continuum. It wasn't that I just dove in at one place. I had been building this relationship with nature over time. And I think that's the piece we have to be really patient with one another and with communities to realize that these are a lifetime's worth of experiences that culminate into you even knowing that the right gear matters and the willingness to invest in that gear or at least find it used. So that's one piece of it, and I think I lost my thought. Thinking about gear. Go ahead. Maybe I'll get it back.
I wrote an article that I became notorious for. It simply took the title off of a bumper sticker in Forks, Washington, and the bumper sticker said, "Are you an environmentalist or do you work for a living?" And in fact, what there was, I took it very seriously. I mean, what is it that began to mark out people who work in nature as being separate from nature and that there isn't a knowledge that comes from working in nature? I think a lot of the people who work in nature really do know an awful lot about the natural world. The trick is the transition that you're talking about. How do you talk about people who, in fact, do these kinds of things? If you're going to look at who replants forests in the Forest Service, they are by and large going to be Mexican and Latin American immigrants who have a huge amount of knowledge of what goes on, but they're never considered as the usual way we talk about people with environmental knowledge. I think it's making that kind of bridge is a very, very important one.
And of course, I remember my thought. So the other piece that's been helpful for us is to really elevate those historical connections to nature and reimagine people in our histories and our families, because we're only a few generations away from those land-based connections. So I think about people like George Washington Carver and Harriet Tubman, who I feel is very much a wilderness leader, and who was able to use those spaces to help people get to freedom. And George Washington Carver took recycling and ecology to do intellectual heights. And so we're rebranding a lot in our work and talking a lot about the assets of those connections as opposed to something to run away from toward the progress of an urban America or perceived progress.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to each one of you. I really was touched by the leave no trace. That's something that I find more and more, that people don't have a reverence for the earth anymore. Like, they're leaving trash everywhere. They go into public places. You see, I was just in Shasta recently, and I saw like plastic running through where you fill up your bottle for water. And I was like, how do people do that? Like, don't they know that this is going to hurt X, Y, and Z? And so we're wanting more people to come into nature and to feel that wildness, because ultimately we feel wild. We feel free. We're like released of all of everything because we naturally are in our state. We can calm down, we can soften, we can open. How do we teach more people about no trace? How do we teach them that maybe if you step there, you might hurt an ecosystem? So you have to be really mindful of where you step and how you step.
Any thoughts?
I just think we have an opportunity to look at Leave No Trace as not an absolute, but contextual. I think about the way that, we may be treating Lake Merritt on a Sunday afternoon, and the ways that we may have a little bit more flexibility in a more remote BLM land. So I see it a lot to do with the scale of human impact. And I'm just, again, I'm thinking about the ways that I developed my relationship to nature, how I went to those creeks when I was 6 years old and put a tadpole in my hand, and the magic that I felt and the way that I was able to connect with that creature that cultivated a love that is part of my life's purpose today. Had I never touched it, this wouldn't be my reality. So I just think we have to balance our relationship and think about the scale of our impact, but also the potential for those relationships to lead to more people being involved with caring and stewarding our lands.
I would just say, Leave No Trace also has a different component to it, which is how many people are out there that you can bury your human waste if you're the only one out in the wilderness area, and that could be called Leave No Trace. If, on the other hand, you're summiting Mount Whitney and there's a couple thousand people a day going up there too, Leave No Trace means you're packing it out. And similarly, you can, put your tent out in the meadow, maybe no problem, but, if you're with a group with 200 people, then it becomes a problem. And so I think, it needs to be something that we're consciously aware of, and consciously, one can ride a mountain bike respectively, or you can ride it in a way that actually turns around and causes a great deal of environmental damage. And so, it's something you just got to constantly be aware of, and I don't think rules are necessarily as much as teaching people ethics.
That's a good distinction. Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
One unintended consequence of the Wilderness Act was that by designating wilderness, you ring-fenced what you wanted to protect, but then everything that wasn't included was suddenly fair game for the logging and mining industries. And so I just wanted to put out there, maybe by naming wilderness, are we making it less wild? And then another thought is that I really agree with Rue that the Leave No Trace thing has gone too far. When you go into natural open space areas where people have gathered foods and roots and berries for millions of years, and you say, no, you can't do that, you don't take anything from the landscape, you deny people an intimacy with the living world that they desperately need in order to get familiar with it, to love it, and protect it. When we say, wilderness is a place where people can visit but not live and remain, are we not denying people the opportunity to live a lifestyle that's low carbon, that's low technology? Is it not our technology and our chemicals and our cars and things that we bring to the wilderness that cause the problem? If people want to live a native lifestyle, the zero carbon footprint, why aren't we letting them? And I would just put forward that our making that behavior and that lifestyle illegal is also contributing to the degradation of our forests. I'm from Plumas County, up north of Tahoe, and this summer has been one of the worst ever for illegal marijuana grows. These are massive, hundreds and hundreds of plants. Mexican criminal gangs come up and they destroy the watershed, they divert water, they leave toxic rodenticides that have killed black bears and foxes and lots of wildlife. And there's no one out there to stop them. So maybe some eyes in the forest in some wilderness areas would actually be a good thing. And our sheriff of Plumas County said, these left-wing environmentalists, if this was the Tea Party coming up here doing this damage to our watersheds and to our land, there would be riots. But because it's growing pot, because it's not considered to be, maybe. So anyway, just some thoughts there.
And so what do you think about that? Can I offer a couple of responses here? I think and I write in my book about what you call sort of the deep Paleocene or the primitivist and folks trying to reclaim ancestral technologies and finding a way or pioneering a 21st century way to live with the land in basically like a return to the Paleolithic. And I think it's very interesting and it's an important experiment. But the problem is 7 billion people can't do it. So who gets to decide who gets to do it? Seriously. I mean, that's a serious question. If we can't, and it's not 7 million people can't do it, probably 7 million people can't do it. And there's 300 million in this country. So who gets to make the decision of who's going to go live primitively on the land and who doesn't get to? So there's a real equity question there. The other thing I would share is that, wilderness areas permit lawful hunting and fishing. So again, that's not exactly leave no trace. That is the traditional arts, and you can't do that in a national park because national park's got its own rules. But a BLM land or a Forest Service wilderness allows lawful hunting and fishing. I think that's fantastic, right? People to be able to go out there and engage in wild nature in a way that's more, not just engage with the land as scenery, but also as sustenance. So that's important, and it's important to recognize that is there in the Wilderness Act. And finally, I would say that, you don't want to rope off one area and then say that everything else is a sacrifice zone, for sure. At the same time, you don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And I think you still want to have some places that have the highest level of protection, and that would be our federal wilderness system. I don't know if there's anything else folks want to add on that point.
I just think there's plenty of open space where people that want to get back to the land can get back to the land without occupying wilderness areas, and they won't be wilderness areas if we allow permanent habitation within them. And so I just think we need to draw a line somewhere, and if every mile there was a new cabin with a road going up to it, that's not where I would want to go to have a wilderness experience.
Hi.
Hi.
I am a student in natural resource management and also, perhaps a little bit paradoxically, in city and regional planning and environmental design. And
no, that sounds perfect. You're a double.
I'm into it. Yeah. So I'm wondering, we had this great conversation about what our decision-making framework should be for making these tough decisions in the face of climate change for wildlands. And I'm wondering how our priorities, our paradigms, our decision-making frameworks should change, if they should change at all, as we move along that spectrum into, regional parks and even further into, urban green space and even perhaps pocket parks and very small, very fragmented patches of nature in the city and in other highly developed areas. Should we, for example, be prioritizing cultural value of a species over ecosystem service value as we move along that gradient? And do we even have a responsibility perhaps to go into urban spaces and start fighting for ecosystem interventions and for more restoration or a greater presence of restoration in our urban areas?
Question close to my heart. That, in fact, I think you have to do that. I'll just give you an example. I'm from Redwood City, and Redwood City is pretty much systematically ruling out all of the land that can be used for wildlife corridors, all the land that's going to be open space. It's a city which is very much in the hands of developers. That the thrust of development is so strong in large parts of California, and the argument that's used against it is very often a wilderness argument. Because, in fact, it doesn't matter if these species are eliminated here, we're going to protect them in a wild area. So all the corridors, all the places where, in fact, it's habitat, that a lot of animals in California are perfectly happy in the suburbs. It's not our job necessarily to drive them out. But the way development works is precisely because these are treated as very different questions, that is not an issue. And, in fact, I'm very glad to hear you're interested in both. I wish you worked for Redwood City.
So in a time of climate change, it's not sufficient to just turn around and say we're going to draw little circles around the wilderness areas and the national parks, and that's where things will survive, because they can't survive within there. None of them are big enough. Yellowstone is 2.3 million acres. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem is 8 million acres. But it involves a lot of different land management agencies and private land and state land and federal land that all needs to be managed cooperatively in order to have the connectivity so that species can migrate and survive climate change. And so that's the key thing, I think, here. There's a thing called large landscape cooperatives, and it's something the Fish and Wildlife Service are the key drivers of. But they try to pull together the state agencies and all the federal agencies and the private landowners and the private timber operators and try to develop some common blueprints. Now, what they do isn't mandatory, but at least they're talking about joint planning and how in the world are we going to manage this broad, big area like the Sierra Nevada or the Olympic Peninsula or, large landscapes like that to allow for connectivity, to allow for predators to move, to allow for vulnerable species to migrate. And sometimes that's going to mean turning around and putting more emphasis on acquiring lands or restoring lands that are in private property that you wouldn't think of right now. If you're thinking of climate change, you've got to think about where is sea level rise going to be instead of, somehow turning around and saying that, the shoreline right now is the shoreline we will protect. And so those are the kind of things in the future we've got to work on.
Thank you for that question. We've just got a couple minutes left. These last two questions that you can each have, but we're going to do 1 and 2, so you both get a chance, and then we'll answer them together. And again, one last plug of shameless self-promotion. I am signing my book in the bookstore at 6:15.
Is there any members or groups in the high-tech industry that are into the outdoors and wilderness or not into it? What's the status there?
Okay, groups in the high-tech industry and what's their role? And yes, sir, you've got the last word from the floor.
Well, prior apologies. This might not have been the last question you wanted. We heard quite a lot about indigenous land stewardship. I would say quite a lot of lip service. Why is it then that there's no major environmental organization which has ever opposed the eviction of tribal peoples from their land? This is going on today in India, it's going on in Africa, and in fact the environmental organizations, if anything, are party to it. They're gross human rights violations. People are being destroyed, just as they were here 150 years ago. Silence.
Okay, so we're going to do Silicon Valley and then indigenous displacement. Anybody on this Silicon Valley?
I don't know. I can't speak to Silicon Valley as a region and their commitment to this, but I do know of some really creative applications that are helping to flatten the barriers between people and some of these wild spaces. Hip Camp comes to mind. That's a fantastic platform that's being really effective in helping to educate people about their local assets. Because, I heard earlier someone mention, pocket parks, city parks, state parks. Most people don't know those distinctions and often don't care, just like the wildlife doesn't. And so finding solutions to help people find access to those places and know where to go and what to do has been really effective and is only growing in interest. And we hope more support in the future.
I teach in the heart of Silicon Valley, and most of the Silicon Valley solutions I'm familiar with are pretty much futurist kind of stuff. That what we're going to do is we're going to commit ourselves to nuclear power. We're going to commit ourselves to, new methods of producing food, which will eliminate agriculture. We're going to do all of these things. We're going to group into large cities, and that is going to open up all the land and solve the problem. I'm not exaggerating too much. This is the kind of thing that the solutions that are talked about in Silicon Valley. As far as the indigenous people, yeah, you're right. It's shameful. And in fact, it's one thing to say you're sorry, as people are pretty good at saying, but it's a very different thing when it's actually happening to step in and stop it.
Or even talk about it.
Bruce?
The environmental organizations aren't even talking about it. They're complicit in it.
Well, you're more familiar with it than I am, and I agree it's appalling and it ought to be addressed. That some of the international meetings I've been at, it has been, maybe it's lip service, but, they recognize different categories of protection and specifically allow for continued indigenous. You're saying no. Well,
what about the only exception I would think of would be the Amazon, where in fact there have been environmental groups which have stepped in the Amazon, precisely because recognizing protecting indigenous people is a way to protect the Amazon.
Well, the best protection in the Amazon is to leave it to the indigenous people. Satellite imagery clearly shows the most forested areas in Amazonia are the indigenous territories. They are not the ones created by the environmental organizations. And it's a very cheap solution.
think, and again, I'm not an expert on the Amazon, but I think there are environmental groups that say precisely that.
Yeah, I think that's true as well. I'd also say, were you at the World Parks Congress in Australia last year? No. So World Parks Congress, addresses very carefully. Bruce, were you there?
No, but...
And so I think that what you're saying is true historically, but I think clearly it's changing because you did have a communique that came out from the World Parks Congress last year among the big international NGOs and the indigenous groups that were there. And I guess I'd also point to Canada and BC. We've got a couple now tribal national parks in BC that were endorsed by most of the, as far as I know, Canadian environmental NGOs who recognize there that that cooperative stewardship, either between Parks Canada and your First Nations there, have worked out pretty well. And you look at the the Haida Gwaii experience up there, where the Haida Gwaii have had essentially a de facto national park there in coastal BC. And as far as I know, all of like Natural Resources Canada, Sierra Club Canada have been in favor of that. And there was the Haida Gwaii who kicked out the logging companies in the first place and are now managing what they call a tribal national park. So that would be, a counterexample.
Yeah, but the people in India being kicked out of tiger reserves and in the Congo Basin and in southern Africa are not going to react like the Haida. They don't have lawyers, they don't have money, they don't have resources. And they've been kicked out largely by the environmentalists.
Sorry, I'm unfamiliar with the situation. Sierra Club doesn't work in India on land protection and tigers.
So that's the wrap up. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for our panelists, Rue and Richard and Bruce.